delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Georgina Clifford, who's going to talk with us about trauma and the current situation that we find ourselves in the world, hopefully with some shareable practical tips that we can use to look after not only ourselves, but also the people who we come into contact with, whether they be in the workplace or at home. So, Georgina, thank you very much for joining us. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about your background and why you're sitting in the hot seat, so to speak?
Okay. So I'm Georgina Clifford. I'm a clinical psychologist. My background was initially in the NHS. I then did a PhD in the area of complex PTSD, specifically around sort of interpersonal trauma, repeated trauma. And I set up a clinic called the London Trauma Specialists, and we offer a mixture of different services. So psychological therapy, expert witness work, training and consultation, amongst other things.
Wow, pretty broad. And I know we've been talking before we hit record about how busy you are right now, not only because of what's going on with the terrible circumstances in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, but also because of the pandemic and the impact that may have had on people.
Yes, I think there's been a big increase in people presenting with different mental health problems, and trauma especially. There is something about the collective trauma of the pandemic, and obviously now the conflict in Ukraine on top of that, which I think tends to exacerbate and bring to the surface a lot of pre-existing mental health problems.
Yeah, we've got these terrible events that we see on our screens and we hear on our radios, and the stories that we see on social media of immense suffering and pain and loss. And it's incredible how we can be affected by that, even though it's not happening to us. What's all that about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes it's surprising to people how much it can impact on them, seeing something from a distance, seeing something in a newspaper. And I think this was very much the case as well with the pandemic. And even if you're somebody that doesn't read the news a lot and tries to avoid social media, we are bombarded with distressing images of places being destroyed, accounts of people losing their homes, people dying, people losing their loved ones, being displaced. And some of it, I think, can feel kind of unreal, but often extremely frightening, and it can feel traumatic. And I suppose the important thing to think about in terms of trauma is that anything that feels like a threat to your sense of self, your sense of safety, stability, anything that feels threatening in some way can be experienced as traumatic. And I think one of the key things, and this is something that was incorporated into the DSM-5, is that people can develop quite significant mental health problems following trauma just by witnessing and reviewing material. So we see that a lot with first responders. We see that a lot with people who work witnessing or reviewing material related to trauma. You don't have to experience it directly for it to be traumatic.
So things like what we're seeing on our screens, the constant 24-hour loop news and things like that.
Absolutely.
That can actually trigger trauma in its sort of clinical sense.
It can. I mean, I do some work with first responders. I also do some work with people who review footage of things like 9/11. More recently, somebody reviewing footage for World War II prisoners of war. And the symptoms that people experience in reviewing that material are the same that we see in people who have directly experienced something traumatic. So there is something about being faced with very distressing, frightening material that can result in symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the key things around post-traumatic stress disorder is that it is actually a normal response to something abnormal, to a sort of life experience that is above and beyond what we would normally experience. And what's normal about it is that in situations where we have a significant activation of our fight, flight, freeze response, so essentially our threat system in our brain and our body, so we have a kind of threat system that kicks off as soon as we face something that feels threatening and frightening. And then what happens is our bodies and our brains have a response to that. And often what happens is that we don't encode or we don't store information quite in the same way. We don't process information in a fairly ordered kind of narrative way. What tends to happen is there are fragments of memory that can get stuck, And then often that can result in post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the key symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder is some form of reliving. And we talk about flashbacks and we talk about intrusive memories and people talk about nightmares. Essentially, what people are experiencing is some replay of the memory that has not been fully processed following exposure to something traumatic. And as you said, it is completely normal for somebody exposed to something traumatic to have those kind of symptoms for the first 4 weeks. We tend to only diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder at that 4-week period because the symptoms have persisted.
And about flashbacks, nightmares, when those things happen, is it as though we're reliving that event? So, I mean, biochemically, is it the same response as though that thing was happening again?
Yeah, I mean, flashbacks, or sometimes we refer to them as symptoms of reliving, are essentially like you are re-experiencing that event in the present. And it's very disorienting and it's very anxiety provoking, because essentially what tends to happen is people will relive that experience with all the same emotions and physiological sensations they had at the time. So if at the time you felt terror, anxiety, shock, if you experienced a racing heart, if you experienced feelings of tension, then what tends to happen when you are reliving it is it comes back almost like that memory has been frozen, and it comes back and it replays in the present. And I think one of the things that's important to remember about flashbacks is that we often think they're just visual. So we you know, we've all seen the movies or the TV programs where somebody's got, you know, a kind of picture of something that comes back. They're not always visual. They can be visual, but they can also be auditory, so you can hear voices. They can just be a sensation in your body. So sometimes you can just replay or re-experience that feeling of panic, that feeling of shock in your body.
And that's fascinating. So it's almost as though the clip is being played again in your brain in a sense. What triggers it though? Because there can be different. Am I right in thinking that the triggers can also be not just visual, but they can be a sound, they can be a smell, a sensation, a feeling?
Yeah, that's right. I think triggers are interesting because sometimes they can be directly related to the experience. So
Right.
if you have a trauma which is related to having been assaulted by somebody, it might be that you see somebody who looks very much like the person who assaulted you, but it might be less direct. So it might be that you see a flash of color that matches the color of the t-shirt the person was wearing, or it might be that you experience the same emotion that you had at the time, and that is enough to trigger it. And sometimes they're more general. So sometimes if you've experienced a trauma involving a person, just being around people, just being on a crowded tube train or interacting with other people could be sufficient to trigger that traumatic memory.
And then a trigger comes along and it becomes a loop almost, that we go through that again, relive until
Yes.
it is processed appropriately.
Well, often people get stuck in the loop because what happens is a trigger triggers something which is highly distressing, traumatic, often associated with lots of unpleasant emotions and physical sensations. So instead of discussing it or sitting with it, people will block it off. So people will say, well, I don't want to experience this. So either they avoid the triggers or they find ways to try and block things out of their head. And a common one is working a lot, you know, keeping as busy as possible, using distraction. Some people say, well, I will just keep the TV on all the time, or I'll listen to music, or I will do whatever I can to try and block it out of my head. Sometimes people will use things like alcohol or substances, attempts to try and push it away. The difficulty is that it doesn't stay where it is. So generally what you find is the more people try and push it away, the more it keeps coming back. So they get stuck in a loop.
This whole circumstance in the Ukraine, the terrible scenes that we're seeing, things that have happened during the pandemic, are triggering perhaps previous traumas that people have been coping with, perhaps even as early as from their childhood.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I hear a lot is people, and this happens a lot when people experience a number of different traumatic events in their life, is people tend to say, well, I held it in a box. You know, I had all these things that happened in my life. I've dealt with all sorts of difficult things. And I've managed to put it in a box, and I've managed to hold it there. And I've, you know, I've raised children, and I've worked, and I've held things together. And then sometimes there is a particular experience which we often refer to as the straw that breaks the camel's back, something which opens the box and things start to flood out. So sometimes there are experiences which just topple everything. And I suppose the pandemic is a really good example, because it did a number of different things. It exposed people to repeated footage and information related to the awful things that were happening, people dying. It acted as a kind of threat to everyone's own sense of safety and security. But also it took away a lot of the pre-existing coping mechanisms that people had. So people who perhaps were reliant on having a very, very busy life, and very busy social life, who got up, who went to work, who went out after work, who did a lot of things to try and keep all of that at bay. A lot of them were then at home, a lot more isolated, a lot more cut off, a lot less able to rely on certain things that they'd used for a long time to cope. So we've seen a definite increase and a definite impact of that kind of experience.
That's interesting, because I know the world of work has changed, hasn't it? So for a lot of people, they'll be working from home, you know, and so I am isolated. I no longer have the office culture around me to, you know, distract me or take my mind off things, or make me feel supported. That's a really interesting dynamic, which I suppose has changed as a direct result of the pandemic. But could that be playing into people's feelings of anxiety?
Absolutely. And I suppose the way I think about it is that if you think about the way we conceptualize trauma, and how a really fundamental part of trauma, and whether or not people get stuck in that loop, is their ability to talk about their experiences, to talk about their emotions, to connect with other people. PTSD gets worse when people shut down, when it is kept in a box, when it's kept in silence, when people are isolated, when people are withdrawn from society. And there was something about the pandemic which meant that people were forced to withdraw, people were forced to kind of work at home. And there's a lack of, you know, the usual connections. And I think we probably underestimate the importance of, I don't know, being able to talk to a colleague about a difficult meeting or a difficult interaction when we go and make a cup of tea at work, or, you know, just having that day-to-day ability to talk about and share some of the things we're experiencing. So a lot of that was taken away. And I think it's not surprising that meant that people are struggling a lot more to cope with any kind of significant emotional and mental health difficulties.
How would I know when that sort of healthy response, that shock and horror about terrible events that are happening, has got more than that, and it's now becoming a problem?
Well, I suppose that the technical sort of diagnostic answer, and this is something that is in the DSM for all mental health problems, is when your symptoms are causing a significant impact on your social and or occupational functioning. Now, I think that's problematic in thinking about it yourself, because when do you decide that it's significant enough? And I suppose, you know, breaking that down into kind of simpler terms, I think if you are re-experiencing particular memories or particular reminders, so let's say you are reading the news every day and you're finding that you are having intrusive images of things that you have seen, things that you have read, if it is causing extreme distress and unpleasant feelings which are interfering with your ability to function, and function means to get up in the morning and get dressed, to go into work, to concentrate, you know, if it's getting to the point where that is intruding so much that you are finding it difficult to do things day to day, then there is a question as to whether or not you might need some additional support in working through some of those symptoms.
Right. We deal with that general anxiety about what
Mm.
currently are. Have you any tips and advice?
Well, I think the first thing that's really important for us, you know, in talking to ourselves, but also in talking to other people that maybe we are supporting or we are working with, is to normalize, you know, and I think sometimes we, you know, perhaps we skip that bit and think, what can I do to make it better? But I think that it is really, really important for us to normalize, to acknowledge that it is always distressing and difficult to see the suffering of others, especially when we're in a situation where we're at a distance, where we feel unable to help or influence outcomes in any way. Yeah. It is really, really difficult not knowing what the future consequences might be. You know, we don't know whether or not this is going to escalate. We don't know whether or not the war is going to involve other countries. We were in a state of quite a lot of anxiety, of helplessness. There is a limit to how much we can actually do to influence things. So I think the first thing is to recognize that it is normal and completely understandable if you are feeling this way. And I think that one of the really important things to do, and we talk about mindfulness, and I know it's a term that's kind of thrown around quite a lot, we use it quite a lot, but actually being mindful of how we're feeling. So that's the first thing, being able to stop for a second and say, okay, I want to really be aware of how I'm feeling. How am I feeling emotionally? How am I feeling in my body? Am I able to fully acknowledge and make sense of what emotions I'm experiencing in the moment, to normalize those, to be able to sit with those without pushing them away? And then I suppose the next thing is to question, do these feel excessive? You know, do these feel like they are above and beyond what is to be considered reasonable in this circumstance? And that's a difficult question, isn't it? But I suppose you're thinking, okay, look, it's normal to feel anxious enough to be distracted at certain moments during the day. It's normal to feel anxious and upset and to get distressed and feel the need to talk about it with other people. But if it is something that means that you've got an hour's work done and normally you'd get 6 hours work done because you are unable to focus on anything else, I think it's then thinking about, okay, is there something that I need to do to manage this? To stop and think, am I doing anything that is exacerbating or maintaining this anxiety? So I spoke to somebody recently who reviews a lot of footage, as I said, from World War II for a film company. And he talked about feeling completely overwhelmed. And I said, well, how many hours are you doing this a week? And he said, well, 40 hours. I said, right, you're reviewing footage 40 hours a week? Yes. And he said that on top of that, every single time he went home, he spent hours reading news stories related to Ukraine. Now, I would say that if you are reading news stories for hours a day and you are noticing that your anxiety levels are going up, then it's important to think about that and to think, well, actually, are there any behaviors? Are there things that I'm doing, whether it's continual reading, checking? Is there anything I can minimize? Because it might be that behavior, you might think that you're reading and trying to maintain some kind of knowledge or control over the situation, but it might be having an impact that's actually making you feel a lot worse, a lot more anxious.
That's really interesting, because it's usually at this point that someone like me in the well-being space will go, oh yeah, just, you know, switch off your social media or stop watching the news because bad news sells, right? And everything's on a 24-hour loop. But we're not saying that those things are bad, I suppose. We're not saying that social media is inherently bad, or that the 24-hour news cycling is inherently bad. I suppose as long as you remember, to your point, that we can turn it on and off.
Well, that's it. And I think it's all about degrees, isn't it? It's you know, if you're checking your social media sort of several times during the day, or you're checking in with news stories, and it's not giving you a surge of adrenaline every time you look at it, then that's okay. But I suppose if you are recognizing that actually the repeated checking of news, that you're doing that so much throughout the day, that actually we're in a constant state of anxiety, it's not necessarily a recommendation you cut that out completely. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be aware. I think awareness is really important. But would it help to minimize that? Would it help to say, okay, I'm going to check the news in the morning, and I'm going to check the news at lunchtime, and I'm going to check it at the end of the day, but I am not going to sit there with a constant stream of updates, because that might be something that results in greater anxiety. When we're faced with all this uncertainty and all this anxiety and this kind of very big sense of social injustice, this very big sense of how wrong the world is, to actually focus on what you can control in the present. And part of that is almost kind of going inwards and saying, okay, first of all, as I said earlier, acknowledge your thoughts and feelings, be more mindful about how you're feeling, come back into your body, engage in what you're doing in the present, because that's a really good way of you know, minimizing some of the anxiety. And I think about that sometimes because people say to me, how do you do your job? How do you listen to all this awful stuff? And part of the answer to that is actually, I'm not just sitting listening. I'm not just sitting reviewing footage of people talking about the horrors in their life. I'm actually doing something to change that. And I think thinking about that more broadly in the face of a conflict like this, you know, is there something small that you can do in your lives to actually, you know, act upon what's happening, whether it's giving money to a charitable organization or whether it's, you know, something else. I think that's important to think about too.
Maybe I'm a manager and I can see that there's a certain member of my team who is really distressed about this. What can I say and do about that?
Well, I would say one of the key things, and it fits with what we were saying earlier about trauma and the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, is quite often people need to talk about what it is that's distressing them. You know, so if somebody is having repeated memories or intrusive images related to something and it's causing high levels of distress, then is there any way that there is some channel, there is some way that could be talked about? So is it possible for people to talk to a line manager? Is it possible for people to talk to a supervisor? I realize this differs depending on what kind of organization you work with. Some people set up a kind of peer support or supervision group so that people can have an hour a week to discuss things that they're finding difficult. Actually helping people talk about and process and be more aware of some of the things they're struggling with and to share those things with other people rather than shutting everything down.
Some manager will be worried that, you know, they're not a doctor, they're not a psychologist. So although talking about this may be good, what do I do if this person suddenly is extremely distressed or becomes extremely emotional? How do I support that person? In other words, is it better for me just not to ask in the first place in case I make it worse? Okay.
From the other side, working with lots of people who have been in situations, I'm thinking about first responders actually is what I've probably got the most experience in. They would argue that in situations where they felt incredibly distressed and in need of support, not getting that support and not having the channels to talk about that within a work environment has actually been, from their perspective, really detrimental to their mental health, because there is something about being supported, being believed, being listened to have someone's experience, have their own experiences normalized in that context, which actually I think is incredibly positive in terms of their own well-being, their own sense of themselves, their own sense of the importance of what they're experiencing. It is likely, as a manager, if you are talking to somebody about something they have flagged up as being really traumatic and distressing, that they are going to get upset, they may cry. And, you know, I think perhaps it's important to acknowledge that that's not a sign that you have done something terrible. You know, it's not a sign that you have made everything worse. And, you know, we often hear people saying, I'm worrying about re-traumatizing somebody. You're not re-traumatizing somebody. They might be having a really strong emotional response because perhaps no one's sat with them in the same way and said, hey, let's talk about what's troubling you. So yes, it might be that they're upset. It might be that they're emotional. That doesn't mean that what you've done is detrimental.
Right.
And I think that's really key.
That's really interesting, because I remember doing, you know, training in the past where it was flagged, particularly in the case of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Don't go probing around. Don't ask questions. Don't invite them to relive what's happened. Don't do any of that. What's your take on that?
I would say that what isn't recommended, and there's a lot of research and evidence around this, is it's not recommended in the immediate aftermath of something traumatic to do a debriefing session. Right. So I think in the past, everyone thought, right, someone will experience something really traumatic, we'll get them all together, we'll do a debrief. I think there's advice that advises against that, and that's partly because you see a natural progression of symptoms in those first 4 weeks. You tend to see that people will react in different ways, and a lot of people will just get better on their own, with their own, you know, coping mechanisms, their own ability to process and work through things. So not to jump in straight away and say, tell me everything, but later on, if people have experienced something that's traumatic, if they are struggling, from my perspective, there is no harm in asking questions. And sometimes, unless you ask those questions, then people will stay hiding things. They will stay in that kind of state of avoidance, that state of being very shut down. And often they are battling with that experience on their own. One of the really, really interesting pieces of research is that they looked at the conditional rates of post-traumatic stress disorder following different incidents. Now, for a natural disaster, often the prevalence rates are around 2 or 3%. For terrorist incidents, it might be around 7 or 8%. And it goes up to about 40 or 50% for people who experience interpersonal trauma like rape and sexual assault. The reason it's much higher for interpersonal traumas is because people don't tend to talk about them. They tend to shut down, they tend to hide away, they tend to feel kind of worried or ashamed or judged. And it's the traumas that people don't talk about, that we don't encourage people to open up about. And you think about the difference between someone who's experienced a terrorist incident and then being interviewed for the newspaper, and perhaps support groups are set up, and we've got a narrative that exists in society but in the media. Whereas there are other traumatic experiences which we don't necessarily acknowledge, we don't necessarily normalize, we don't talk about in the same way. People are more likely to develop PTSD if they shut down and they don't talk about it. I would say that sometimes if someone's very shut down, if someone's very avoidant, if someone feels embarrassed or ashamed about talking about not just what they've experienced, but what they're struggling with, then sometimes you need to ask questions. And I've often given the example of my brother and his now wife were in Nepal on honeymoon when there was the earthquake. And when they got back, you know, people said to them, oh my goodness, where were you? How did you get to safety? You know, did anyone help? How are you feeling? Are you okay? Lots of questions about their experience. And I would always contrast that with, I've worked with hundreds of women who've been raped and sexually assaulted, and they will say, no one has asked me about what happened. And I think that there are certain things where we're frightened to ask the questions. We're worried that we're going to upset somebody. We're worried we're going to say the wrong thing. And sometimes people really want to talk about it. And I think, you know, so actually being able to, assuming that you are being considerate and you are being sensitive and you are normalizing the reactions that people are having, I would say there's no harm in asking questions. If somebody falls apart to the point where you are concerned that they are not going to be able to cope, going home, carrying on with their job that day, taking care of things as they would do ordinarily, then I would say that perhaps they might need additional support. Perhaps they might need some trauma-focused therapy. Perhaps they might need to go and, you know, speak to somebody in terms of having an assessment. And I recognise that's difficult to gauge, but I suppose we're all able to have some sense of what's normal for people we know. So if you've got a friend, if you've got a colleague, you know how they normally are emotionally, what kind of things they're normally able to manage in terms of their workload, you know, the kind of responsibilities they have, whether or not they're looking after themselves. Often we're able to spot signs that someone's struggling above and beyond what would be considered normal. And I guess you have to make that judgment. You have to think, okay, right, I think that in this situation, this person is struggling more than I would expect them to struggle just by me asking the question about the impact of the footage in Ukraine. And it might be that it's triggered a lot of stuff from the past. And it might be that that box has come open. And it might be that they have got to the point where they feel unable to hold things together. And if that's the case, then perhaps they would benefit from some support from a professional in a different context.
Let's say, for example, I am a manager, or I have a friend who is really struggling with what they're seeing and hearing on the news right now. You know, I can see that it's anxiety related. It may not be PTSD or meet any diagnostic criteria, but I can see that this person is in distress. How can I open up that conversation and talk to them about it? What do I say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always of the opinion that it's quite important to ask directly, you know. And I think that even working in the field as a psychologist, we're often afraid to ask directly, but actually sometimes that's the best way. So if you recognize that somebody's struggling, I would be inclined to say, well, I can see you're struggling with some of this footage, or you're struggling with, you know, the news about the conflict in the Ukraine. I'm just wondering whether you want to talk about what it is that's worrying you, or your experience of you know, how you're reacting in terms of what you've seen. Just open it up directly. I think being we're often encouraged when we're training, be transparent, you know, be transparent in kind of what you're asking. And sometimes you kind of just set it up and just say, look, I'm concerned about this. I've noticed this. Do you want to talk about it? Is there anything I can do? You know, is there anything that would help you right now to actually open up and talk about this a bit more?
Is there anything we shouldn't say or do right now in supporting someone else, for example? Is there anything we shouldn't be doing?
Well, I suppose saying anything that and the things that people find difficult when they've experienced some kind of trauma, or they are struggling with any kind of trauma, whether it's directly or it's being exposed to it, is anything that leaves them feeling judged, that leaves them feeling invalidated. It's you know, I hear all the time people coming and saying, I spoke to my friend, I spoke to my mother, and they said, oh, come on, you're all right, pull yourself together, it'll be fine. Or, oh, you shouldn't be worrying about that. Or anything that cuts it off and invalidates the experience that someone's having, people tend to find really tricky. And I think one of the key things about that is that if somebody has taken the step towards being more open about what they're struggling with, and someone shuts it down and dismisses what they've said, they are less inclined to talk about it again. And you see this over time with people, that people tend to shut down because they haven't been validated. So validation is really important. So if anything you're saying is invalidating or dismissive or critical of how someone has responded or how someone feels, then I would say, yeah, that's not recommended. That's not a good idea.
I'm very aware, you know, I'm a dad. I know you have kids.
Mm-hmm.
Talking to children about what's going on can be really quite challenging, not knowing what to say or what not to say. Do I spare them the full horrors, or do I expose them to what's going on? As a parent, I suppose everybody will make their own decision. But I wondered, you know, my daughter's 11 years old, and she came home from school the other day, and she's terribly worried about this. And she said to me, Daddy, if there's a World War III, will you have to fight? And so these are the thoughts that are going through my 11-year-old's mind. I can't imagine she's the only one. No. How do we talk to our children about what's going on?
Yes. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, isn't it? And I think, you know, similarly to thinking about the way that we deal with trauma and horror and shutting it down, I think sometimes we have this this tendency or this desire to protect our children by not talking to them at all. You know, and some of us probably can recognize that, have parents like that. Or we just don't concern them with that. Just don't talk about it in front of them. And I think it's probably important to recognize that even if you are not talking directly to your children, they are picking up snippets on the news. They are hearing their friends talk about the conflict in the Ukraine. It's very hard, no matter how much we try to completely protect our children from it. So I think, and I'm going to refer to a really good resource that I found online, which is the UNICEF have put together something, again, freely available online, which is how to talk to children about conflict in the Ukraine. And I'll take some tips from this myself in thinking about my own children. So one of the things, and I think this is really important in the first instance, and it kind of connects with what I was saying about us being mindful of our own reactions, is look for changes in their behavior. You know, it is not going to be surprising or uncommon if our children are exhibiting or expressing feelings of worry, anxiety, uncertainty. If they are feeling worried and frightened about what's going on, you might see changes in their behavior. You might see disrupted sleep. You might see mood changes. They might be fighting with their brother and sister more than usual. You might be seeing sort of behavioural changes. So I think being aware of that first of all. And the next thing is to listen first. So do they want to talk about it? I'm aware I haven't had a lot of discussions with my own children. And I think, if they ask a question, if they want to talk about it, then be led by them. If they are asking a question, I think it's important to engage with that. And if they do, give them your full attention, take their lead. And if you can, use their words, use their language, try and talk about it in the way that they're talking about it. And one of the recommendations is a good starting point is to understand what they already know and find out how they're feeling before you go from there. So don't make assumptions about what they're feeling. Ask open, curious questions, much in the same way as you would with a grown-up, with an adult, with a colleague, with a friend. Ask about how they're feeling. Using kind of age-appropriate language, so watching their reactions, seeing how they're responding, and speaking to them as calmly as you can. And I think this is the thing that's difficult, isn't it? Is that we're aware that children often pick up on our own anxiety. So if we're talking about, the conflict and we're very stressed and anxious, they are going to feel more anxious. One of the research studies that came out of the Second World War, which I always took quite a lot of comfort from and I thought was brilliant, was that they looked at the mental health difficulties of two sets of children. One, the children who were sent away to the countryside away from their parents, and the second that were kept with their parents in the midst of the Blitz and the bombing and everything else. And they found that the children who stayed with their parents fared better overall than the children who were sent away. And I was thinking about that. There's something protective about, you being there for your child. And, I'm assuming that something very positive about being able to be there for your child in a calm, consistent manner where you're not, feeling or expressing or showing a lot of anxiety. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean you're expected to say that it's not affecting you at all, but something about not scaring them, not making them feel more anxious than they are. I think another thing that's really important is to reassure them that they are safe. Currently they are safe from danger. There is no evidence currently to suggest that we are in imminent danger of something happening here. And that also people are working hard to try and stop the conflict. And the other thing that's recommended is that it's important for children to know that people are helping each other with acts of courage and kindness. And the recommendation is that, find positive stories for your children. So whether it is examples of people carrying out particular deeds or using that kind of sense of committed action to do good things for other people. And the recommendation is to, ask your children if they'd like to do something. Would they like to draw a poster or write a poem or take part in some kind of fundraising? Is there a way that they can become involved so they feel like they're actually contributing in some way?
Fantastic. So key things that I'm hearing from you is that we shouldn't be quiet about this. We're not going to make things worse by talking and being non-judgmental, non-dismissive, and valuing people's contributions. Don't be scared of asking people how they're doing. Look out for the signs. If you've noticed that somebody is behaving in a different way or there's a change in their behavior, let's make sure that we're speaking to them about that and letting them know that we've noticed, and just offering a non-judgmental listening ear, which in my experience, people are always scared about getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing, and as a result don't say anything at all, or not have any answers. But most of the time people don't want answers, right? They just want the opportunity to be heard.
I think that's a really good summary, and I would say I don't think it's about answers, and I would say if there is a take-home message, and better to say something than nothing. Better to listen to what people have to say, and better to respond, even if it's just with some kind of understanding or normalization of what they're experiencing.
Fantastic. Georgina, thank you so much for your time. I know you're super busy and very much in demand right now, but I'm so grateful for the time that we spent and for you taking us through some really practical tips and advice and guidance on what we can do to help people who might be struggling right now. So I'm sure this won't be the only conversation we have, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. But all the resources that you've mentioned, I will make sure that there are links to in the tab section under this video. So once again, thank you very much.